The night does not always reveal its secrets in thunder or in fire. Sometimes it begins with a cry, small but relentless, echoing through the walls of a house too proud to listen. Behind those walls, choices are made that no one speaks of in daylight, choices that leave scars deeper than silence. And in that silence a bond was born, one forbidden, one condemned, and yet one that carried more truth than all the rules meant to contain it. Tonight, you will hear a story that begins in secrecy and ends where no one could have predicted. What would you do if the only person who could save your child was the one you were taught to look down upon? And what would happen if pride forced you to cast aside the very hands that held your child's life? The answers are not simple, because this is not a simple tale. It is one woven with grief, survival, betrayal, and the raw power of love. This is not just about a boss and a maid, but about the line between judgment and redemption, a line that vanishes when life itself hangs in the balance. Stay with me, because each moment of this journey pulls you deeper into a world of broken rules and unspoken truths. It is a story of a child who refused to give up, a woman who dared to act, and a man who discovered that money could not buy what he had lost. You will find pain here, yes, but also the kind of courage that changes everything. So let us begin, because the night is waiting to reveal what pride tried to bury. Michael was 2 months old, and the night would not give him mercy. His cry started as a thin ribbon of sound, then climbed until it filled the hallway. The baby monitor blinked like a tiny lighthouse that nobody answered. Air in the nursery felt warm and stale and heavy with spoiled milk. Curtains breathed in and out with the breeze, as if the room itself waited. Somewhere a clock kept time that no one respected. The crib rattled with each kick of his small feet. A house that once hummed with quiet routines now trembled on the edge of panic. Vanessa Carter was supposed to be close by, yet she was not. Her phone lay on the dresser with a dark screen and a smudge of perfume. Her sweater hung on the chair as if it had a body a moment ago. The kitchen light still glowed, which made her absence feel louder. Neighbors might have heard the child, but nobody knocked. She had stepped out for reasons that would not hold up to daylight. Promises she made at noon meant little after midnight. Michael did not know promises and cried anyway. Laura Evans, the housemaid, paused at the base of the stairs. She knew the sound of a hungry infant, and this was worse. It carried a kind of fear that gets under the skin and stays. Her hands shook, and she hated that they did. The rules said staff stayed in their lane and kept quiet. The rules did not listen to a child. She told herself to breathe and then moved. Each step felt like a choice that could not be taken back. In the nursery, a bottle waited in a ring of lukewarm water. A thin, sour note rose when Laura opened the lid. Milk clung to the plastic in tired streaks that told a story. It had been warmed once, then left, then warmed again. She had seen shortcuts like this in other houses, and they always cost. Michael turned his head blindly toward the smell, and then away. He coughed and his voice cracked with wear. Laura set the bottle down as if it were evidence. She checked the crib with steady hands that betrayed her heart. Michael's fists clenched and unclenched as if he could grab comfort from air. His cheeks were blotched with the kind of red that worries nurses. Sweat beaded along the hairline and cooled too fast. He tried to root against the blanket and found nothing. The pacifier lay on the floor like a bad idea. Laura whispered something that was not a prayer yet felt like one. He quieted for half a second, then cried harder. Down the hall, the living room slept in neat silence. A glass on the coffee table left a clear ring like a careless signature. A handbag rested open with a half-eaten candy bar inside. It looked like the end of a scene in a play when actors exit too soon. Laura called Vanessa by name and got only the house in reply. She checked the back door and saw a smear of lipstick on the latch. The garden lights made long shadows that pretended to be people. There was no one to hand this moment to. She thought of protocol and the handbook in the drawer. It advised notes and logs and calm messages in the morning. The handbook did not cover a baby gasping for the space between cries. It did not cover warm milk turned wrong or the way fear smells. Laura stood in the doorway and felt the weight of choices. This was not her child, and still her heart answered him by name. She remembered a doctor saying she might still have milk for a while. The memory landed with a hush that asked for courage. In the mirror above the dresser, she hardly knew her own face. Grief had thinned it and made the eyes larger than they used to be. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear just to buy a second. Michael hiccuped and then gave a sound that was almost a plea. She moved back to the crib and gathered him with care. His body was hot against the inside of her arm. He relaxed for a heartbeat and then arched again. The room seemed to lean closer, as if it wanted an answer. She tried the clean bottle and he turned away. She tested the temperature and found it fine and still wrong. He fought the rubber nipple like it had insulted him. Laura held him upright and walked because rhythm sometimes helps. She hummed without words and felt the tune find its own shape. He listened then, forgot to listen, and cried once more. There are moments that choose a person, and this was one of them. It arrived without announcement and waited in plain sight. The front gate clicked in the distance and then went quiet. If Vanessa had returned, she did not call out. If Daniel Harris had come home early, the alarm did not say so. Laura looked at the clock and saw hours that made no sense. The house belonged to a man of schedules, yet the night ignored them. Michael burrowed against her and searched with instinct older than rules. Her breath matched his in a rough, uneven duet. She knew what would help and feared what it would cost. Outside the nursery, the corridor stretched like a question. Past choices stood there like portraits that did not blink. Michael's cries slid into soft sobs that sounded like surrender. Laura closed the door, and the latch made a small brave sound. A decision gathered itself inside her like weather. It was simple and human, and against every line in the handbook. She held the child a little closer and steadied her voice. The night waited to see what she would do next. Laura had known this ache for weeks, and it still moved like weather through her chest. She had folded tiny clothes and put them away, then taken them out at night. Milk had come in and stubbornly stayed, a private tide that would not recede. Doctors told her time would teach her body to let go, but time ignored the memo. She wore loose blouses and pretended the damp was just from the heat. Pain made a home behind her ribs and refused to pay rent. She walked the halls at night to keep from drowning in the quiet. Now the same quiet begged her to act. Michael nuzzled the crook of her arm, and her body answered before her mind did. A deep ache pulsed, and said a word older than rules. She felt the pull begin like a whisper that knew her name. Shame and fear wrestled for a seat at the table, and neither wanted to leave. She thought of the handbook and of people who talk big in the morning. She thought of a child who did not need speeches, only breath and warmth. Her heart chose the smallest truth it could hold. Help him now. She checked the door and drew the curtain until light turned soft. She washed her hands and the motion steadied her like a habit from childhood. She placed a clean cloth over her shoulder, the way her mother had shown her. Every small step felt like a promise to do no harm. She whispered to Michael that he was safe, then waited for his breath to slow. He rooted again with the stubborn hope only the very young carry. Laura gathered herself with a breath that trembled at the edges. Then she offered what only she could give. The first latch was clumsy, some part of him unsure and frantic. She adjusted her hold and brought him closer, cheek to cheek. His mouth found her, and the room changed shape. Sound dropped away until there was only the rhythm of swallow and breath. Warmth spread through her like a tide finally allowed to reach shore. The ache shifted from pain to purpose, and she exhaled a quiet yes. Michael sighed, a little broken sound that mended as it left him. The clock on the wall forgot its job. His cries fell to pieces, and then to silence that had weight and meaning. His hands unclenched and floated in the air like small flags of surrender. Color returned to his cheeks, as if someone had drawn it with care. He paused now and then to breathe, then dove back with new resolve. She felt him relax against her. A new thirst had ruled him for hours. The bottle on the dresser looked like a bad choice made by a stranger. She caught a tear with her wrist and did not pretend it was anything else. The house felt different, as if it finally remembered how to be kind. Memories flashed in quick cuts that moved too fast to hold. A crib that stayed empty, a name she still could not say aloud, nurses who spoke softly, a form she signed with shaking hands. The way neighbors stared, not knowing where to place their pity. Yet here was this child, alive and needy and real as her own breath. Her heart did not ask permission to love him even for a moment. She let the feeling in, and it did not break her. Instead, it stitched a torn edge she thought would never mend. She knew what people might say if they ever learned. Lines get crossed, stories twist, judgments travel faster than truth. She pictured gossip poured like oil on a tile floor. Still, a life was in her arms, and his need cut through the noise. She decided to keep record in a way that mattered, breath by breath. If there was a price to pay, she would meet it standing up. Courage often looks small from the outside. Inside, it feels like the only door left unlocked. Minutes stretched and softened until they felt almost gentle. Michael drank with steady patience, then drifted, then returned. His brow smoothed and the sharp little hiccups faded away. His skin warmed under her touch and no longer felt glassy. She watched the rise and fall of his chest like a tide that had found its moon. Relief curled through her body and asked to stay. She shifted slightly so he could rest without losing comfort. The night caught its breath and waited for what came next. When he finally loosened his hold, she lifted him to her shoulder. A tiny burp escaped, and she laughed before she could stop herself. She wrapped him in a clean blanket that smelled like cotton and sun. He blinked up at her with the slow wonder of the very tired. She laid him down and kept a hand on his chest. The small drum of his heart tapped out a calm that reached her own. She cleaned the counter, tossed the spoiled milk, and opened a window. The room learned a new kind of quiet. She wrote a simple note for the morning and placed it under the bottle ring. Then she sat in the rocking chair and let it move the way rivers move stones. A car passed outside, and the headlamp skimmed the nursery wall. She imagined doors opening, voices rising, questions that cut. She did not know which storm would arrive first, anger or rumor. She only knew a child now slept because she had chosen mercy over fear. Somewhere at the edge of the house, a hinge creaked like a throat being cleared. The next sound would decide what the night became. Daniel Harris came home earlier than usual, footsteps echoing through marble that carried no warmth. The house seemed calm until a faint sound pulled him toward the nursery. He expected the hush of sleep or the steady hum of a lullaby. Instead, he opened the door and found a sight that cut him in two. Laura sat in the rocking chair, Michael nestled against her, nursing with quiet need. The air snapped tight as if someone had struck a chord out of tune. Daniel's jaw tightened, words lining up before he knew their shape. The image burned itself into him like a truth he was not ready to face. His voice broke the fragile silence with sharpness that startled even him. "What are you doing?" came out louder than intended, a question and an accusation. Laura's eyes widened, but her hold on the baby did not falter. Michael sighed, content, unaware of the storm above him. Daniel stepped forward, torn between fury and disbelief. He saw rules shattered, boundaries crossed, and a trust he never gave being used. For a man built on reputation, appearances mattered more than whispers, and this scene, if spoken of, could ruin them both. Laura wanted to explain, but words seemed brittle. She opened her mouth, then closed it as Michael stirred. His peace felt too fragile to risk breaking with noise. She met Daniel's gaze with something steadier than fear. "I couldn't let him starve," she said softly, each word carrying weight. Her voice trembled at the edges yet refused to shatter. She thought the truth might be enough to shield her. Daniel's silence proved otherwise. He turned toward the hallway, pacing like a man trapped in his own home. The image refused to leave his eyes, following with every step. Scandal whispered in his mind, though no one had spoken yet. He imagined neighbors, business partners, acquaintances knowing this detail. It wasn't just his pride at stake. It was his name, his standing, his family's shadow. The more he thought, the heavier the chains of expectation grew. He felt them wrap around his chest until breathing was work. And still, in the nursery, Michael slept peacefully for the first time in days. Daniel returned and lowered his voice, though anger still dripped through. "You should have called me, or the doctor. Anything but this." His words struck like cold rain, dismissing her act of mercy. Laura looked down at Michael's calm face and found strength there. "Would you rather have come home to a lifeless child?" she asked, not cruelly but with truth. Her words hung in the air, heavier than stone, impossible to dodge. Daniel flinched, though he did not show it. The truth pierced deeper than he cared to admit. Still, pressure from unseen eyes pushed him to stand taller. He thought of staff whispering, of stories that spread like fire. Already he imagined the way this could be twisted. A maid overstepping, a household out of order, a man mocked for weakness. Daniel's pride could not allow that image to take root. Even as he saw Michael safe in her arms, the weight of reputation dragged harder. He felt anger not at Laura, not even at Michael, but at himself, because deep down he knew she had saved his son. Laura stood slowly, placing Michael back in his crib. The baby stirred, whimpered, then settled with a sigh. She smoothed the blanket with hands that did not shake. Her calm only fed Daniel's turmoil. How could she stand so steady while he felt undone? Her grief had carved strength he could not comprehend. He was left with nothing but the brittle shell of control, and even that began to crack. When Vanessa finally reappeared hours later, her excuses thin as paper, Daniel's choice hardened. The truth should have cleared Laura, but gossip was faster than reason. He feared what would be said if others learned what he had seen. Whispers had destroyed men with thicker armor than his. In the end, He convinced himself he had no choice. He let fear wear the mask of authority, and so Laura would have to go. The decision echoed long after the words were spoken. Laura received her dismissal with silence that stung more than protest. She did not beg, though her eyes glistened with something unshed. She simply nodded, knowing the weight of the world could be cruel. Daniel watched her leave and felt something fracture inside him. Michael's cry rose again, this time sharp and hollow. Daniel reached for him, but the child turned away, restless. For the first time, Daniel felt powerless in his own house. A choice had been made, but the cost had only begun. That night, the mansion lay in uneasy quiet. Daniel stood by the window, glass of whiskey untouched in his hand. Every shadow whispered of judgment. Every creak spoke of regret. He thought of Laura's words, still lodged like thorns in his chest. Michael's restlessness carried through the walls, echoing like accusation. Daniel told himself it was for the best, yet the words rang hollow. Pride had won the battle, but it had left him alone. And somewhere outside, Laura stepped into darkness with no hand to guide her. Laura walked out of the mansion with nothing but a small bag and a heart that felt heavier than stone. The city stretched before her, wide and indifferent, swallowing her steps without notice. She searched for comfort in the faces she passed, but no one looked twice. The dismissal letter in her hand was proof of a world that turned too fast. Without references, her name meant little in the language of employment. Doors closed politely at first, then firmly, until they didn't open at all. Her dignity slipped through her fingers like water. Still, she pressed forward, each day harder than the last. At first, Laura thought determination would carry her. She dressed neatly for interviews, spoke with care, and clung to hope. But whispers traveled faster than her footsteps. The story twisted, each retelling sharper than the last. Employers heard half-truths wrapped in scandal and shook their heads. Smiles that began warm cooled when they asked for references. The silence that followed was an answer she could not fight. Hope became a fragile flame flickering in the wind. Rent was the first enemy she lost to. The landlord tapped his pen against the ledger, voice firm but not cruel. He had no room for sympathy, only numbers that refused to bend. Laura tried to negotiate, offering work instead of money, but the man waved her off with tired eyes. When the notice came, she folded it neatly and placed it in her bag. The day she left the apartment, her footsteps echoed in the empty hall. Her keys clinked one last time before disappearing into the landlord's hand. The streets became her ceiling and floor, the city her unwelcome host. She learned which benches allowed the longest rest. She learned how to fold cardboard to soften the bite of concrete. Hunger taught her patience, though it was a cruel teacher. She walked past bakeries where the scent of bread was almost unbearable. The world kept moving, indifferent to her small collapse. People looked away when her eyes met theirs. Invisible, she carried her grief in silence. Nights were the cruelest. The cold settled into her bones no matter how tightly she wrapped herself. Shadows stretched into threats, footsteps into dangers. Every sound made her clutch her bag tighter. Sleep came in broken pieces, stolen rather than given. She woke often, heart racing, unsure if she was safe. The stars above her felt distant, like secrets meant for someone else. Morning never brought relief, only another day to survive. Laura searched for work in places she never thought she'd enter. Diners, laundromats, shops with fading signs and tired owners. Everywhere she went, the answer was the same. No references, no job. Her skills, once praised in the mansion, now seemed worthless. She scrubbed dishes for coins, swept floors for leftovers. But even those chances grew scarce. The city gave little to those who had nothing left to offer. Her clothes lost their neatness. Her shoes wore thin. She tried to maintain dignity, smoothing her skirt, fixing her hair. But mirrors in store windows reflected the truth she wanted to ignore. The woman staring back looked older, worn and tired. Strangers avoided her as if misfortune were contagious. The world measured her worth by appearances, not by heart. She carried herself with as much grace as she could manage. Yet each day, that grace grew harder to summon. One evening, rain began without warning, heavy and merciless. She ran for shelter under a bridge, clutching her bag. Clothes clung to her skin, and the chill gnawed deeper. Around her, others huddled, faces lined by stories like hers. For the first time, she wasn't alone in her invisibility, but companionship born of despair felt hollow. She curled into herself, whispering promises she could not keep. The city's heartbeat drowned her voice. Despite the misery, fragments of resolve clung to her. She remembered Michael's face, peaceful in her arms, The thought gave her reason to breathe through the hardest nights. Her body weakened, but her spirit clung stubbornly to survival. She told herself this storm was not the final chapter. Somewhere ahead, the story had to shift. Yet with each step, the weight of despair pressed harder. The line between hope and surrender blurred in the rain. Laura's silence became her shield. Words no longer held power in a world deaf to her struggle. She saved her voice for prayers no one heard. Each day she survived, though survival felt less like living. The mansion, once her prison, now looked like salvation. But the bridge above her was the only roof she knew. Misery did not just visit. It settled in as a tenant, and the city watched, unmoved, as her story darkened. Michael's cries returned with a vengeance once Laura was gone. The mansion, once orderly, now echoed with a sound no one could soothe. His tiny fist struck the air, demanding a comfort that never came. Vanessa tried to feed him, but the bottle was refused again and again. Neighbors could hear the wails through the open windows. Inside, the staff exchanged uneasy glances, whispering when Daniel turned away. Every attempt to calm him ended in failure. The absence of Laura hung in the air like an unfinished sentence. Days passed, and his refusal to eat became more than defiance. Bottles piled in the sink, each one barely touched. Doctors came with stethoscopes and measured tones. They spoke of stress, of possible infections, of remedies that promised little. Daniel listened, his jaw set, frustration hidden under a thin mask. He paced the nursery while Michael's cries grew weaker. Each sob sounded like a plea that stabbed deeper than any insult. And still, the solution eluded them. Michael's cheeks lost their softness. His eyes grew dimmer. The healthy glow that once charmed visitors was gone. He slept longer, not from peace but from exhaustion. His body grew lighter in the arms of those who held him. Every breath seemed harder to claim, every sigh a battle. Nannies came and went, each confident at first, then shaken. None of them lasted more than a few nights. Michael rejected them as if his very soul recognized the difference. Daniel began to watch in silence, the weight of guilt pressing harder. He remembered Laura's words, her quiet defiance in the nursery. The memory gnawed at him in moments of solitude. Yet pride kept his lips sealed, even as doubt grew. He wondered if he had chosen reputation over life. The thought refused to leave, circling in his mind without mercy. Every time he entered the room, Michael's gaze slid past him. That distance cut deeper than any rumor could. The household sank into unease, staff moving with hushed urgency. Meals grew cold while attention centered on the failing child. Daniel spent long nights by the crib, pretending he could fix it. He whispered promises Michael was too weak to hear. Doctors returned, offering solutions that fell like broken glass. No one dared suggest what Daniel already knew. The boy's decline mirrored the absence that haunted them all, and silence became the most damning witness. Hospital walls soon replaced the nursery's painted clouds. Machines hummed in sterile rhythm, wires tethered to fragile skin. Nurses moved quickly, adjusting tubes and murmuring to one another. Daniel stood at the foot of the bed, more spectator than father. He saw numbers dip on screens he did not understand. He heard terms like critical and failure to thrive. The language of medicine did little to soften the truth. Michael's life hung by a thread, and Daniel knew it. Sleep became a stranger in Daniel's nights. He sat by the window, staring at city lights that mocked him. Whiskey dulled nothing. Regret sharpened everything. Every whisper of staff reminded him of Laura. He saw her ghost in the rocking chair, her calm defiance, her mercy. He tried to bury it, but Michael's decline was proof carved in flesh. Daniel realized pride had turned into poison, and now it was killing the only thing that mattered. Michael stirred, opening his eyes with effort. They were glassy, unfocused, yet searching for someone. When Daniel leaned closer, the child turned away. The rejection pierced like a blade hidden in silk. Daniel whispered his son's name, but the room stayed cold. Love, when delayed, often arrives too late. Michael's silence said what words could not, and Daniel felt his strength falter. Doctors warned of choices that might come soon. Talk of feeding tubes and long-term care filled the halls. Daniel listened, numb, wondering how it had come to this. Every suggestion felt like a punishment for mistakes he couldn't undo. He thought of Laura, and the shame of needing her returned. But Michael's weakening heartbeat silenced that pride. The mansion that once seemed so powerful now felt empty, and Daniel, for the first time, knew he could not face this alone. The crisis grew unbearable, pulling every eye toward the fragile crib. Michael no longer cried. He only whimpered, as if the fight drained away. Nurses tried everything, their compassion genuine, their hands steady. Yet the missing piece could not be replaced by science. Daniel's nights became endless corridors of regret. Each echo of Michael's shallow breath reminded him of his folly. He could see only one path left, though it terrified him, and the thought of seeking Laura again became impossible to ignore. Daniel left the hospital with a storm inside him. The doctor's words rang in his ears like a curse. Michael's chances were fading. Machines could keep his son alive, but not give him the will to survive. The memory of Laura's calm embrace haunted every corner of his mind. Her voice, her defiance, her courage. He saw it all too late. Now pride was useless, reputation meaningless, and silence unbearable. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt powerless, and desperation gave him only one path forward. He began his search in the places he thought she might have gone. Former employers, agencies, neighborhoods she once mentioned in passing. But Laura's name carried no weight in those offices anymore. Every inquiry was met with shrugs or polite refusals. Some looked at him with suspicion, others with pity. It stung to realize how invisible she had become. Her absence was more than a gap. It was a disappearance. And he was chasing shadows in a city that had no mercy. Days blurred into nights, and Daniel refused to rest. He walked streets he'd never dared to enter before. Alleys smelled of rain, smoke, and forgotten lives. He lifted photographs from his wallet, showing Laura's face to strangers. Some shook their heads. Some didn't bother to answer. A few muttered that women like her vanished quickly here. Their words chilled him more than the night air ever could. Still, he pressed on, unwilling to surrender. The city tested him at every turn. Wealth meant nothing in neighborhoods where hunger ruled. His polished shoes slipped on wet pavement as he crossed under bridges. He stained his jacket on rusted railings, his pride breaking piece by piece. He heard whispers of a woman who fit Laura's description, always the same, thin, tired, drifting like a shadow. Every lead sent him further down paths of despair, and every step reminded him how far he'd fallen. Finally, one evening, rain poured without warning. Water gushed down the gutters as the streets blurred into rivers. Daniel's umbrella turned inside out, useless against the storm. He ducked under an overpass, breath ragged, suit soaked through. And there, in the dim glow of a streetlight, he saw her. Laura lay huddled on cardboard, skin pale, lips trembling. Her body curled into itself, clutching the last fragments of warmth. Daniel's chest clenched at the sight. For a moment, he could not move. The woman who had saved his son now looked closer to death than life. Her clothes were torn, her hair matted with rain and dirt. Her eyes were closed, but her chest rose weakly with each breath. He crouched down, calling her name softly. The sound seemed foreign in the hollow echo of the bridge. She stirred faintly, eyes fluttering, confused, and recognition brought a shadow of pain across her face. "Laura," he whispered, voice breaking for the first time in years. "I need you. Michael needs you." Her eyes filled with disbelief, then sorrow. The memory of her dismissal still burned too deeply. She turned her face away, as if the words were poison. Daniel reached for her hand, icy and frail in his own. He begged again, the word catching in his throat. "Please." The rain roared louder, but silence stretched between them. Laura's lips parted, but no sound came. Tears mingled with the water dripping from her face. Her strength seemed gone, her body too weak to rise. Daniel lifted her gently, realizing how light she had become. She did not resist, though her eyes held mistrust. It was not forgiveness he saw, only exhaustion. But Michael's image pulled her from the edge of surrender. They reached the hospital just before dawn. Nurses rushed forward, startled by Laura's condition. Daniel's voice cracked as he explained who she was. They carried her away, leaving him trembling in the hallway. For the first time, he bowed his head and prayed. Not for himself, not even for pride, but for her survival. Because without Laura, Michael's hope was already gone, and he knew it. In the sterile corridor, Daniel sat with his head in his hands. He had found her, but at a cost he could never erase. Every mistake, every rash decision had led to this night. Now both lives hung in balance, one in a crib, the other on a stretcher. The man who once ruled boardrooms now ruled nothing at all. Only desperation remained, raw and unrelenting. And it left him waiting for the moment that would decide all three fates. The night gave no answers, only silence. Laura's body fought for survival in the hospital bed, pale and fragile beneath thin sheets. Doctors moved around her, adjusting fluids, monitoring vitals, whispering cautious optimism. Daniel lingered nearby, guilt etched into the lines of his face. Every beep of the monitor felt like judgment, reminding him of choices that nearly cost 2 lives. He clutched the edge of the chair, eyes fixed on her shallow breaths. Michael's cries echoed faintly down the hall, pulling him tighter with each sound. He knew they would not stop until she was by his side, and he prayed she would have the strength to rise again. Days stretched with unbearable tension, but Laura slowly began to recover. Color returned to her cheeks, her eyes opened longer each time. Nurses smiled, encouraged, and finally allowed Michael to be brought in. Daniel carried his son, hesitant, as though holding a fragile secret. Michael whimpered, restless, weak from his long decline. When Laura's gaze fell upon him, something unspoken sparked. Her hand trembled as she reached forward. The boy's whimpers broke into a cry that pierced the room. The moment their skin touched, silence claimed the air. Michael nestled against her chest, as if he had never forgotten. His body relaxed, tiny fingers clutching the fabric of her gown. The shallow breaths gave way to deeper, steadier ones. His lips searched instinctively, and for the first time in weeks he fed. Laura's eyes blurred with tears, spilling freely as she held him close. Daniel stood frozen, the sight unraveling the armor he carried. Hope bloomed where despair had ruled. The staff watched in quiet awe, some blinking away emotion. It was a reunion more powerful than medicine, more healing than any machine. Michael's frail body found strength in her presence. The monitors reflected it, numbers climbing back towards safety. Nurses exchanged nods, acknowledging what science could not explain. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, shame and relief crashing together. He realized Laura had given back what pride had nearly destroyed, and he could only watch humbled. Laura whispered softly to the child, words only he could understand. Her voice shook, but her love poured steady as a river. She promised he would never be abandoned again. Michael's eyes fluttered open, locking on hers for a fleeting second. It was a look Daniel would never forget. Recognition, trust, belonging. In that fragile gaze, all doubt vanished. The boy had chosen his mother, and it was not the one written by law. It was the one carved by sacrifice. For Daniel, the sight was both miracle and condemnation. He saw the bond he could not replicate, no matter his efforts. His wealth, power, and name meant nothing against the simplicity of love. Each moment reminded him how wrong he had been. He had thrown Laura into darkness, and yet she returned to light Michael's path. Her courage was not born of choice, but of heart, and in her arms, Michael found the peace he had been denied. Daniel swallowed hard, unable to speak. Laura pressed her cheek to Michael's head, inhaling the faint scent of him. It was both memory and rebirth, stitching wounds left raw. She rocked gently, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. Her tears fell onto his skin, blending sorrow with joy. Michael drank without resistance, his strength slowly returning. The lull of his satisfied sigh filled the sterile room with warmth. Daniel lowered his eyes, ashamed to meet hers. Yet part of him longed for forgiveness. Night after night, Laura stayed with Michael, refusing to let go. She slept in the chair by his bed, her hand always resting on him. Daniel returned each morning, silent, watching from the doorway. He did not interrupt the quiet rhythm between them. Instead, he listened, learned, and carried the weight of his mistakes. Michael's cheeks began to round again. His cries softened. Laughter had not returned yet, but its shadow lingered, and that was enough for now. One evening, Michael smiled for the first time since her dismissal. It was faint, brief, but it lit the room like dawn breaking. Laura's laughter followed, free and unguarded, filling the air. Daniel felt something fracture inside him, both painful and liberating. The smile was a victory, proof that love could mend what pride had shattered. Michael's tiny hand reached up, brushing against Laura's face. Her tears flowed again, unstoppable, but this time they were healing. Hope returned, fragile but real. For Daniel, the reunion marked a turning point he could not ignore. The weight of reputation no longer compared to the life before him. Michael's revival was not born from medicine, but from love's return, and that love lived in Laura's arms. Undeniable, unshakable. The path ahead would not be simple. Trust would not come quickly. But at that moment, watching mother and child bound by fate, he knew one truth. Without Laura, his son had no future, and without Michael, Laura's healing would never be complete. Laura returned to the mansion with steps both heavy and uncertain. The gates opened as before, but now they felt like barriers more than doors. Servants glanced at her with whispers barely contained. eyes full of speculation. Daniel had insisted on her return, yet the silence between them was sharp. Michael reached for her instantly, calming in her arms as if nothing had changed. But beneath the surface, scars ran deep, visible only in the tension of her gaze. The house was the same, yet it no longer felt like home. It was a place that demanded trust she was unwilling to give. Michael thrived again in her care, laughter slowly weaving back into the halls. His health improved, cheeks rounded, and his cries softened into coos. Doctors marveled at the transformation. Nurses nodded knowingly. But Laura did not forget the nights under the bridge, the cold that bit her skin. She carried that memory like armor, invisible but unyielding. Daniel watched from the doorway, torn between gratitude and guilt. Every smile from Michael was a reminder of Laura's irreplaceable presence and of the fragile ground on which they all stood. Laura established rules of her own, without asking permission. She demanded respect, not only for herself, but for the bond she had with Michael. No one else would decide what was best for the child in her arms. Vanessa was dismissed quietly, her excuses no longer needed. Laura set feeding schedules, bedtime rituals, and routines only she could enforce. Daniel tried to object once, but Michael's wails silenced him. Authority had shifted, and Laura held it firmly, though without arrogance. Her strength was born not of pride, but of survival. Daniel struggled with the weight of his own reflection. He had built his life on power, reputation, and control. Now all three seemed hollow in Laura's quiet defiance. He offered apologies in fragments, unsure if they carried meaning. Laura accepted none openly, her silence sharper than words. He tried small gestures, flowers left at her door, words of thanks, but her eyes held caution and her body stayed guarded. Forgiveness, he realized, would not be bought with gifts. The mansion carried tension like a storm that refused to break. Meals were shared but often silent, each bite measured. Michael was the thread that bound them, his presence softening edges. Laura laughed with him, sang lullabies, kissed his brow. Daniel listened from a distance, longing for that closeness. But each attempt to join was met with walls he could not climb. Laura gave her devotion freely to the child, not to the man. Trust was a currency he had long since squandered. At night, Daniel walked the halls unable to sleep. He passed Laura's door, hearing the faint hum of her lullabies. He wanted to knock, to ask for forgiveness aloud, but fear held him back, the fear of hearing no. His pride had built walls, and now he did not know how to tear them down. Every step reminded him of the man he had been, and how far he needed to fall to deserve her trust again. The silence of the mansion pressed against him like judgment. Laura, though cautious, could not ignore the change in Michael. His joy returned because she was near, his health mended under her care. She knew her place was beside him, no matter the cost, but that knowledge did not erase betrayal. Her nights were filled with memories of hunger, of rain, of whispered prayers. She remembered Daniel's cold dismissal as clearly as her own heartbeat. Each time she looked at him, the wound reopened just a little. Love for Michael kept her there, not forgiveness. Daniel began seeking advice from unexpected places. He spoke to nurses, to neighbors, even to the house staff. How could he rebuild what he had destroyed? Answers were vague, yet one truth was clear. Trust takes time. It could not be demanded, only earned, piece by fragile piece. He realized the man who ruled with authority had no place here. Michael and Laura needed something softer, something human, and he would have to learn it, step by step. Still, mistrust lingered like smoke after fire. Laura often avoided his eyes, choosing silence over confrontation. Daniel accepted the distance knowing he had earned it, yet he refused to give up entirely, staying close without forcing entry. Each day brought small changes, a nod, a shared glance, a softened tone. They were not bridges, but they were beginnings. Michael thrived in the space between them, unaware of the tension. His laughter was the one truth neither could deny. The mansion became a place of fragile coexistence. Laura guarded her heart, Daniel struggled with humility, and Michael grew. They shared rooms but not yet a life, moments but not yet trust. Every day tested the limits of patience and the weight of memory. Daniel prayed silently for another chance, not knowing if it would come. Laura kept her walls high, protecting what had once been broken, yet somewhere beneath the mistrust seeds of change lay waiting, and time, relentless and quiet, would decide what grew from them. Time passed, and the mansion began to breathe differently. The air no longer carried only whispers of mistrust, but also the sounds of growth. Michael's laughter spilled through the rooms, louder and more frequent. He clung to Laura with a love that deepened each day. Daniel watched, learning more in silence than he ever had in business meetings. The bond between woman and child was undeniable, unshakable. What began as necessity grew into permanence, and slowly, a new shape of family began to emerge. Laura's devotion to Michael knew no bounds. She rose before dawn to prepare his meals, to hold him through restless nights. She sang softly, her voice carrying warmth no walls could contain. Her care was not that of an employee, but of a mother. The papers would later confirm what love had already decided. She began the process to legally adopt him, step by cautious step. It was a battle, but one she fought with calm resolve, because Michael was already hers in every way that mattered. Daniel stood by, watching as the legal path unfolded. He signed documents with hands that once resisted change. Each signature was both surrender and acceptance. He knew this was not about losing a son, but gaining something larger. He admired Laura's quiet strength, her steady defiance. She had become what he could not deny, the heart of their home. Michael's survival had carved new roles for them all, and Daniel began to see the man he wanted to be reflected in her eyes. At first, he stumbled in his attempts at fatherhood. He was clumsy, awkward, unused to the demands of a child. Michael cried when Daniel tried to hold him too long, but instead of retreating, Daniel persisted, humbled by the challenge. He learned to feed, to change, to walk the halls with him at night. Laura watched carefully, measuring his growth with cautious eyes. Her trust was slow to return, but Michael's joy softened her edges. Together, they navigated each fragile step. Nights in the mansion grew different. The once cold and lonely dining table now hosted 3. Michael babbled between spoonfuls of food, demanding attention. Daniel listened, smiled, even laughed at his son's stubborn will. Laura corrected him gently, guiding his clumsy efforts with patience. Their lives were no longer divided by walls, but tied by small routines. Love did not appear all at once. It built itself quietly, and the house slowly filled with something it had lacked: warmth. As weeks became months, the adoption papers were finalized. The judge's gavel struck, but the real decision had been made long before. Laura held Michael close, tears streaming freely. Daniel placed a hand on both of them, silent but firm. In that moment, titles no longer mattered. Maid, master, or father. They were bound not by roles, but by choice. The scars of their journey were still there, etched deep, but the paper confirmed what love had already sealed. Daniel's transformation surprised even himself. He no longer lived for reputation, for whispers of respect. Instead, he measured his worth by Michael's smile, by Laura's guarded acceptance. He traded late-night deals for late-night lullabies. The mansion became less a fortress and more a home. He worked less to control, more to be present. And though the past remained heavy, the present offered redemption. Laura noticed, even if she didn't say it aloud, Michael thrived in this new chapter, his energy unstoppable. He crawled across polished floors, tugged at curtains, filled the rooms with noise. Laura followed, patient, while Daniel learned to chase behind. The child's laughter stitched broken parts of all their hearts. Neighbors whispered again, but this time the stories were different. Rumors turned into admiration for a household reborn. Daniel no longer cared for their approval, only Michael's, and Michael's approval shone in every smile he gave. The path was not free of conflict. Arguments still sparked. Mistrust still lingered in quiet moments. Laura remained cautious, unwilling to forget the pain. Daniel accepted that forgiveness would not erase scars, but each time Michael reached for both of them, something shifted. The boy became the bridge they had not known they needed. He bound their wounds with simple, stubborn love, and in his laughter, they found reasons to keep trying. So a new family was born, not perfect, but real. It was built on broken pieces, reshaped into something stronger. Laura, once cast aside, now stood as Michael's mother in truth and in heart. Daniel, once a man ruled by pride, learned humility through fatherhood, and Michael, the child who almost slipped away, became the soul of them all. The mansion still held shadows, but now it also carried light. What began as tragedy grew into unexpected redemption, and in that fragile balance, love quietly took root. Life in the mansion never became a fairy tale. The walls still carried echoes of past mistakes, whispers that time could not erase. Laura often walked the halls at night, remembering the bridge, the hunger, the cold. Daniel, though changed, still bore the weight of choices he could never undo. Michael grew stronger, his laughter chasing shadows, but scars remained. They learned to live not by forgetting, but by carrying those scars together. It was not a story of perfection, but of survival. And survival, in its own way, was love. Laura embraced her role as Michael's mother with fierce devotion. Her love was born not of blood, but of sacrifice and persistence. Every time she held him, she remembered the night she chose courage over fear. That memory gave her strength on days when doubts returned. She was no longer invisible, no longer the maid in the corner. Her voice carried weight, her presence demanded respect. The past had stripped her of everything, but it had also remade her, and she chose to live not as a victim, but as a mother. Daniel changed in ways that surprised even himself. The ruthless businessman faded, replaced by a man who valued presence over power. He still stumbled, still faltered, still fought pride in quiet moments. But Michael's tiny hand in his own reminded him what mattered. Laura's steady defiance taught him humility, patience, and endurance. He learned to listen more than he spoke, to build rather than control. The man who once cared only for reputation now cared for family. And that transformation was his greatest victory. Michael grew in the midst of these struggles. He learned love not as something polished, but as something fought for. His earliest memories carried warmth and tension in equal measure. But he was never alone, never abandoned, never unloved again. His bond with Laura became unshakable, the foundation of his childhood. His trust in Daniel grew slowly, like light returning after storm. Together, they gave him a family carved from broken pieces. And that imperfection made it real. The mansion, once a stage for pride and whispers, became a home, not flawless, not free of conflict, but alive with honesty. Meals carried laughter alongside arguments. Nights carried tenderness alongside silence. Every day demanded effort, demanded humility, demanded choice. And every day they chose to keep going. They did not chase perfection, they chased presence. And presence, finally, was enough. Scars lingered, reminders etched into their lives. Laura's mistrust never vanished entirely, though it softened with time. Daniel's guilt remained, though he learned to live with it. Michael grew up surrounded by truth rather than illusions. They spoke of the past not to dwell, but to remember. Pain had shaped them, and they did not pretend otherwise. It was in the cracks that love found its way, and it held them together when nothing else could. Neighbors watched, some still whispering, others admiring. Stories of scandal transformed into stories of resilience. What had once been gossip became legend in quiet tones. A maid who became a mother, a man humbled by his own mistakes. Not everyone understood, but those who did saw strength. Their lives were not for approval, but for the boy who thrived in their care. Michael's smile was the only truth that mattered, and it silenced even the harshest of rumors. Laura often thought of the bridge where she almost surrendered. The memory never left her, but it no longer owned her. She carried it as proof of how far she had come. That night of despair had led her here, to Michael's embrace. Daniel sometimes stood at the nursery door, watching quietly. The sight of Laura and Michael together healed him in ways nothing else could. Regret still whispered, but gratitude shouted louder, and gratitude was enough to keep him moving. Their ending was not wrapped in ribbons or easy promises. It was made of hard truths, fragile forgiveness, and relentless effort. They did not erase the pain they built around it. Their love was not perfect, but it was enduring. The scars reminded them of what almost was lost. The laughter reminded them of what they had saved. Together they formed something rare and unpolished, a family, flawed but genuine. And so, the story closed, not with fairy tale perfection, but with truth. Laura, Michael, and Daniel carried their wounds like badges of survival. They learned love through loss, forgiveness through suffering, family through choice. Their lives were messy, imperfect, yet bound by unshakable threads. They did not escape pain, but they turned it into strength. They did not erase the past, but they built a future anyway. It was not a perfect family, but it was theirs, and in that reality they found their ending. Not every wound heals cleanly, and not every scar fades. Laura, Daniel, and little Michael carried their pain like shadows that never truly left. Yet within those shadows, they also found the courage to build something lasting. It was not a family born of perfection, but of struggle, forgiveness, and second chances. And in that fragile balance, they discovered a truth few dare to face. Sometimes the deepest love grows from the harshest trials. Tell me, if you were in Laura's place, would you have had the same courage to act when silence could have cost a life? And if you were Daniel, would pride have blinded you until it was almost too late? These are not questions with easy answers. They are mirrors, showing us what we value when tested. Perhaps, like them, we only learn who we are when there is no choice left but to fight for love. And perhaps that is what makes this story so haunting and so unforgettable. If this story moved you, let your voice be heard. Share your thoughts in the comments. Did their choices surprise you? Did they remind you of someone in your own life? Your words matter, just as this story mattered to those who lived it. And if you want more tales like this, full of conflict, discovery, and raw emotion, make sure to subscribe, leave your like, and activate the notifications. There are many other stories waiting for you here, each one carrying its own secrets, scars, and moments of redemption. Thank you for staying with me until the end. Every story we share binds us together in ways we often cannot see. I'll be waiting for you in the next one, where new emotions, twists, and revelations await. Until then, take care, hold close those who matter most, and never forget the power of compassion. See you in the next video. Until next time.